Hello and welcome to HR Unplugged, episode 42. How to nail the interview, hiring the right employees with the right interview questions and scoring. Getting the hiring interview right can be hard. Making sure you ask the right questions, score the interview, and then sift through the multiple candidates is a big task. In this episode of HR Unplugged, Anita Grantham, Vanessa Brulat, and special guest Casey Bailey, head of people at Deel, do a deep dive on the questions you should ask to find the right hire, how you should score each interview, and why your internal interview questions should differ from external interview hires. Thank you for tuning in. Today's episode is brought to you by BambooHR, the complete HR software. Simplify HR with award-winning solutions for everything from hire to retire with BambooHR.
Hi, BambooHR here. Do you know what your employees really want? I mean, besides more money, of course, and better benefits, maybe an in-house masseuse. Ooh, a never-ending supply of chocolate chip cookies fresh from the oven and gooey. Besides all that, what do they want? Well, they want to feel energized and free to do their best work. That's where I come in. I'm user-friendly, fast, accurate. Employees, managers, admins, they all love me. It's easy to switch, too. Give it a try at BambooHR.com. That's BambooHR.com.
So, Casey, I'm so excited to get started and start a conversation. Really looking forward to our discussion today. Tell everybody a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so hi, I'm Casey Bailey. I live in the U.S. I'm in Utah, up in the mountains of Park City. Been here for about 10 years. I started my career in HR consulting, so spent about 10, 11 years in HR consulting for a boutique firm. And after that, I went in-house to companies like Retail Me Not in Austin, Texas, Backcountry.com here in Park City, Utah, for those who are familiar. Ultimately landed at Uber, based out of Chicago and San Francisco. Back to Utah at a company called Divvy, for any of you here in Utah that are aware, and then ultimately landed here in the head of people role at Deel. And at Deel, it's a little bit like our founders foresaw the future coming out of COVID, as Deel was really built as a contractor, a fintech company, really, a contractor payments platform, and enabling the management of contractors, but specifically the payment of contractors across borders and across the world. And then as people began to move around and people were looking for solutions come out of COVID, really moved into the employer of record space and then ultimately into the global payroll space. And we're playing across all three today.
It's so fun to watch, Casey, you and Deel grow as we've gone past COVID and we're really into this multinational work environment where people want to be anywhere. Companies want to hire from anywhere. And we have such a great, diverse audience here that I was really excited to get Casey on the show to talk about hiring. So I wanted to start us off with a fun question. Please put your answer in the chat. What is your favorite interview question, Casey?
Yeah, so mine sounds a little basic maybe, but really across any different level or type of role or job, I always ask the person towards the end of the interview, what would you need to be successful here? And I think that has shown up for me differently when I've been at different companies. But specifically here at Deel, I find it so important to understand because that has told us so much when talking to people. We have almost 4,000 people now sitting across 105 countries. And so working in a fully global remote environment, we really need to understand and make sure we're articulating, of course, what it's like to work here. But even if the person has the best skill sets, could be the best fit in terms of experience, gut checking how they want to work, how they think they could be successful, what they need. Because if someone is telling us that they need to go into an office 2 days a week or see people, it's not going to be the place for them right now as we don't have offices. So it's always an interesting question. Sometimes it catches people off guard, but I feel like it always pushes into some other element of the conversation where we have a chance or I have a chance to elaborate more about what the job is or the role or the work or the experience or working at Deel in our environment, or allows them to question and ask more questions of me or of us around what it's like for us and how we're successful and what do we like about working here.
I love that. And I love all the questions in here. Why are you the best candidate? How do you handle stress is a good one. Tell me about a time when you admitted fault to something. I love this to see if people kind of own it. So many good things. Everybody should copy and paste all these questions out of the chat. It'll be great material. And Casey, I agree with you when you ask what you need. it gives people a chance too to say, are they like self-aware enough to know what I need to be successful? Not everybody's done that work, to be like, this is what I really need. And it's such an important way to think about what you need and then interview the company to see if they can provide that, like what you're sharing.
Yes. And I think we find it. I mean, so I feel successful when we've asked all the right questions, but specifically that question. And we know that we've articulated and we have people opt out because they've interviewed us back, right? And found, just to your point, that self-awareness of, actually, that's not the environment that I'm looking for. That's not exactly the right role. So I chalk those up to success.
I do too. I love this. This Adam Grant quote says, give me the names of 4 people whose careers you have fundamentally improved. Now, I don't know that I agree with this. Casey, I'm curious your talk. Givers give the names of people below them in their career path. Takers, because, Adam Grant wrote that book, Give and Take. So he says takers give names of people above them, people more influential. Takers are good at taking what they need or what they want or need from people. Givers ask, what can I do for you? He believes the negative impact of taker is double or triple the benefits of a giver. It's about weeding out the takers, he says. And I actually think it's opposite of that. Like, I always love to share the stories of when I got somebody promoted to be my peer or above me through our influence and our roles, Casey, because we're moving people all through all levels. So I thought that was interesting that I'd be labeled as a taker. I don't know. What do you think, Casey?
I think it's not so black and white as that, right? I think it needs to be a little bit more flexible, to your point, right? I think it highly varies by your role. Yeah, I would say the same as you. I love seeing, I'm ultimately a business partner to my CEO, to my other peers, to people above me. And I love influencing them, but I don't think of myself as being a taker.
Yeah. I love this one Jamie put in that I asked you, are you looking to leave your current job? Like, are you running from something or are you being pulled towards something? I think is another really interesting indicator of where they are kind of in their career path too.
Yeah, I love that. And again, the self-awareness piece, right? Of what are they actually looking for to achieve?
Yeah. I'd love to hear in the chat how many of you are both screening and doing like hiring manager questions, or if you have somebody doing screening and then you're passing off to the hiring manager. Casey, what's your thought here? How do you decide which questions count in the screening bucket or in the people basket or from the hiring manager or potential cross-functional team?
Sure. So as I just referenced, you'll hear me talk on any question, right? I think we have to be so flexible. I know we've got folks that are managing the full gamut of HR and recruiting, and then we probably have some specialists on the line, and then we probably have some people in some really large teams. And obviously for us, at Deel right now, yes, just a massive amount of applications that we're getting on a weekly basis. We have it dialed in versus, what our sourcers versus our talent acquisition specialists versus the hiring managers and everyone on the panel is going to be asking and scoring people against, because we just have to be more coordinated to be as succinct and as efficient in our processes. But when you're in those smaller teams or you're running more of the full gamut, I think it's important to understand, what do you want the handoff to be and what is your agreement with, right? Like, what is each side of accountability with that hiring manager? We were just talking earlier about, recruiting is not something that you do to or for the organization. You do it in partnership with the hiring manager or that hiring team, right? You're not necessarily the decision maker on that hire. So how best do you think about your processes to enable and support and hand off highly qualified candidates? Sure, for some of us operating in larger teams, right, we have a metric for our talent acquisition team on the quality of candidates that they're passing along. But when you're in those smaller teams too, keeping that quality in mind, because that makes you more efficient. It makes the hiring process and then all of those trailing metrics more efficient. So when you think about that screen, making sure that that hiring manager has been able to articulate to you, or you've been able to research and investigate to understand what are going to be the most efficient screening questions, whether you're getting 30,000 applications a week or 3, right? Understanding how am I going about that? And with passive candidates too, right? Once you engage with them, to know what are the most key and critical things of experience, skill set, and ability on the technical side, and maybe some of those values or cultural questions too, again, so that you're handing off the most qualified candidate pool.
Yeah, great thoughts. And so many thoughts in the chat too. There's a question from Lois for you, Casey. How much time do you allow for screening interviews?
Yeah, so they're anywhere dependent upon the role, 30 minutes to an hour for the talent acquisition specialist or even sometimes the sourcer to spend on that initial screen. For some of our roles where we have a really large end count of open roles, even some of our hiring managers are taking some of those initial screens, or where it's a more niche role, right? Or maybe a more senior role, executive role, et cetera, where you have maybe someone else like a hiring manager or head of HR or someone else that's taking that initial screen. But that's generally about in the range of where it is, that 30 minutes to an hour.
That's great. And then I love this question from Julie too. Like, I find it hard not to ask some of the same questions at every stage because different people hear different things. And a lot of times it's not the answer, but the way they answer that makes the difference. What are your thoughts there on taking a question all the way through each stage?
Yes. I mean, you always want to verify, right? And to your point, sometimes it's heard in different ways. And you notice that when you get to some of the debriefs or even with the way that you're reading the notes, right, or in the scorecard, where someone heard something completely different in that answer or it meant something different to them in the answer. Specifically on some of the values questions, I see that a lot across our set and how that shows up. It could also be that the person asking it is asking it in a certain way or adding color, I've found. So it's not always on the person being interviewed. But I do like that as well, having like a consistent question. It's almost like a trending engagement score or trending something else that you're managing, right? Like you want to ask it over and over and over to just verify the answer.
Yeah, it's such a good way to think about it. Here's another great question that I hear a lot. I'm curious, Casey, in your process, especially doing 700 hires a quarter, how many interviews should a candidate have to go through at each, before the offer stage? Because I think about like, how on earth is your team doing 700 hires a quarter, like with all these interviews? So I'm sure you've got some great tips on how to streamline it. But I do think regardless if you're hiring, 7 people a quarter or 700, this is a really important thing to focus on.
Yes. And it could be like contentious too, right? I'm sure for some of you on the ground having this discussion with a manager or an executive or trying to figure out what that balance is. But if you think about some of the more sought after roles, such as engineers that are hot in the market, specifically in certain markets, that you're operating in, wow, that time to hire becomes super critical. We have a time to hire metric that we'd like to be 24 days or less. So that's something that we're specifically driving towards to be as efficient. But still, for those engineer roles, as an example, we've got 3 people, sometimes 4 on the panel, depending upon the level that they've got to get through, code test, have a review. So again, trying to make it as quick as possible if you are going to have multiple steps in the interviewing process. So I don't know if there's, again, a magic number. I think it highly depends upon the role that you're hiring. It might be 1 or 2, or it might be 5, right? We just hired a C-level role where we had 5 different steps in the interview process and some other ones going on in the middle of it. So keeping flexible, but trying to understand what is absolutely required and necessary so that you're not adding in additional fluff where you don't need to, or doubling people up, right? And making sure that they understand how to run that type of interview if you want to reduce the time. But if you're specifically looking at that time and not wanting to lose candidates to be efficient, then also making sure you understand, what do I need to know from this candidate? So that intake becomes so critical. And you can Google some intake processes or intake documents, but making sure, having a template that everyone is using consistently. And we use the same intake document across any role that gets opened at Deel, and making sure the manager is completing that, because that's going to be the fastest way to get efficient in the hiring.
Oh, such good tips. Thank you, Casey. It's so good. And now I want to talk about the really important part. If I want to hire somebody at Deel and I don't want to do a scorecard, what happens to me?
Well, then you don't get to hire them, Anita. No.
No offer approval.
No offer approval.
How to score each interview. So Casey, give us your thoughts here, because I think this is so important and it's something I know our audience really struggles with.
Yeah. And again, I get that I've worked with executive teams or leaders or hiring managers, department heads, whatever you want to call it, that don't want to complete the scorecard, right? They want to give you a thumbs up, thumbs down in Slack. They want to, just talk to you. They want to write a one-liner. And maybe that's fine. until it isn't, right? And so specifically at Deel, we saw several areas across our sales development representatives, customer support specialists, software engineer, product manager, a couple of roles, right? Very specific roles where we had a high end count of people that we were hiring as well as in function. And we watched them over a period really looking at first year retention. And we could see, right, the points at which people drop off. And when we look, and because quality of hire became so important for us, because retention was so important for us, that's when we started backstepping into, okay, how do we start controlling or gaining control over quality of hire? That's hiring manager and panel enablement, right? The training of those people so that they know and are also share that same metric. Leaders sharing the same metric as me as quality of hire. But also the scorecard was one of those actions that we took to develop, again, making that intake so critical so that we understand exactly what we're looking for, making sure that that attrition feedback, whether it be exit interviews, voluntary or involuntary performance reasons, is circling back to talent acquisition. Sometimes that loop doesn't get closed when you see attrition. And so all of those things kind of built into, we need to make sure we know what we're hiring for. The intake form is there so we can screen and get to the right candidates. But then we need the panel completing the scorecard so that we can see the consistency across the answers. What answers are more important? You know, if someone was in dissent, right, what do we go and talk to that person about? Do we need to have a debrief? No, we don't have a question on debriefs, but I think debriefs are also a hot topic. And do you force a debrief or not? We are not forcing debriefs unless there's dissent, right? Okay. So different ways that you can think about it, but I think it's about, you know, if quality of hire or metrics like retention are important to you, and if you start to see a problem, if you're not enforcing the scorecard today, then maybe that's an outcome, right? To show this is an action that we can all take. And then how do you think about that in terms of also defensibility? Sometimes you see this, and we don't like to talk about the non-fun things like claims or internal versus external debates of who you ended up hiring. But it also becomes defensibility documentation for you too, which certainly as you grow as a company or depending upon if you're public or private, right, those things become important. And being able to show that we hired, you know, the most skilled person for the job.
I love how you've done this because a lot of times, you know, people don't think about the scorecard related to quality of hire and retention, right? They see it as a top of funnel tool. So for people that haven't really implemented this process before or they're struggling with it, what do you think each interview scorecard should include, you know, at a baseline?
Yeah. And you don't have to overdo it, right? Again, stay flexible, stay
I don't
simple.
like scorecards. But at the same time, I got one that had like 2 areas the other day. And I'm like, this isn't robust enough. So you got to balance that out.
Right. When I was at Uber, it was big. We had T's, top things about the person, and B's, bottom things about the person. That was it at one point when I first started. And then I look at where we're at now. And, you know, our engineering scorecards, for example, look different than our account executive scorecards, look different than customer support. So again, be flexible with your teams. Base it in that intake document. What do we need to know? And sure, try to get some consistency, like our values section, hiring for our values. We have a hiring for our values playbook. There's questions. People are assigned things. Like it's very prescriptive, but sure, on the technical and experience level things, and even some of the testing you might be doing, like code testing for engineers, that can be more specific to the job. But yeah, I think 2 is probably not as many as you might need. But again, making it as simple as a format as possible. And if you are in a larger company and have ATS that's connected to Slack, where you can do it in Slack or whatever your communication tool is, even higher adoption we've seen in people being able to do it in their normal mode of communication without having to pop back over into your applicant tracking system or a Google form or something.
So I'm glad that you brought this up. The system is always the key. I'd love in the audience, put in what you're using for your ATS, applicant tracking system. And Casey, I'd love to hear your thoughts. If I can't purchase an ATS, you know, what are some other things that I could use?
Yeah, don't worry about it. You're probably using Microsoft or Google, right? So you could pretty much replicate what you need in a Google Sheet, a Google form, or the equivalent on Microsoft to be able to build that out to scale. It's just about, you know, what is the accountability for people to complete it? And are you willing to go the distance to not approve those offers, right? Or to at least ask some harder questions if it hasn't been completed before you bring someone in.
Yeah, this is awesome. So let's go to part 3. internal versus external candidate interviews. I think this is something we've all struggled with. I was sharing a situation with Casey that I just went through where I have a great internal candidate that I really want to give a stretch role. As I interviewed external candidates, she just doesn't have the experience that these other two have. So I think I'm going to go with an external. So what have you seen work well, Casey? What are the watch outs? How do we treat these interviews consistently but different because we know the internal person and we know their skill set?
Yeah, I mean, that's it for me. I think this is a little bit of a marketing and reputational play when you have internal candidates applying for roles. I love it when you're able to either through a Google form process or through your ATS process, be able to have a separate application for both internal and external, because you already know your internal people. You don't need for them to complete a whole new application. You probably have that information and you know them. And so demonstrating to them that you know them, but also there's probably some workflows on that side of the internal where you want to make sure, is this person eligible to move around? And maybe you're checking that with a manager or the HR team, right, to make sure that eligibility is there and bringing the visibility. Again, I know there's sometimes some tension or some discussion internally on how visible you want that to be at what step when the person is wanting to apply for an internal job. But again, differentiating them enough so that they know you know them. And then thinking about, again, if you're looking at both internal and external, like in Anita's example, making sure that you understand what are the critical questions consistently that you're asking both groups, right? Both internal and external candidates. Because again, when you think about creating that scorecard or the defensibility of your decision to hire, especially if you're going with someone external instead, making sure that you understand, why did we choose that person? What's that decision path? I always gut check everything. Would I stand up at an all hands and be able to explain, like, respectfully the decision that I made on something? I put that kind of gut check with making a decision, because we need to go back and have that follow through on the internal candidate, that they put them through the same or similar process to the external candidate, and an external candidate has demonstrated a higher level of skills, abilities, experiences, but I've got meat, right, to take back to that internal candidate, either me and HR or me and TA or the manager of that person or the hiring manager. Lots of options there, but making sure you come full circle to think about the retention of that individual. What can I let them know that their skill sets are that they need to continue to expand upon? Maybe I even have programs internally that we can invest in them to get them to that next level, but thinking about their retention and making sure we circle back.
This is so important, Casey. I'm glad you brought it up, because I don't want to lose this teammate. She's fantastic and she's definitely high potential. So, but oftentimes we don't think about what that is, right? She's already put together, a resume. She's gone through an interview process. She could go look and be like, why don't I just go interview for this job somewhere else? So what are some other tips that you have, for internal candidates when they're not selected? And also, like, would you have them interview their boss if they were in an interim role? How do you think about those things?
Yeah. So for the interim role, yes. Again, I know that's like philosophy and culture of the organization, and lots goes into that. But I do like to bring them in, even if they are in the role today as an interim, operating in the role. They're also going through the internal process, right? But we're also looking at external. Be honest, be transparent, right? That this is the process, this is what we're doing, and have that job description, right? That you're anchoring to on what are we looking for, and bring them along in that change, whether you might be selecting them or not. But certainly if you're not selecting them, making sure that maybe they were first in the panel, but if you think that you're moving towards hiring that external person, bring them in the loop. Maybe they have a meet with that person. Maybe it's not like a formal interview, but some connection, because what you're trying to show to them is that I've gone to market and hired someone that this is not a promotion for. This person has been established, operating at this level, and here's what they can come and do for your career. And I want to get you excited about that, right? And then I think for other internal candidates that maybe aren't operating in the role already, or maybe they are, looking at them and saying, what else is in our toolkit? And certainly that will maybe differ depending upon your size of organization, learning and development budgets, things like this. But what else is in our toolkit? Is it acknowledgement, right? And like kudos, recognition that's important to that person? Is it exposure to someone, like, or a special group of people or an executive? Is it a learning and development budget? Is there something that we could give to them? Is there another stretch project we can move them to? what other ways could we invest in them? Again, looking at their longer term retention.
These are such great questions. Another thing for all of us to write down. I mean, these should be happening. We've talked a lot about stake conversations on this show, Casey, but ultimately you're asking these questions before they go through the interview process. That would be the gold star of this approach, right? You're asking these questions as part of your development conversations, because sometimes, and I've done this too, where I encourage somebody to apply for a role, they don't end up getting it. And then there could feel like this lack of integrity in it, right? Like you thought I was good enough for this, but now you're not picking me. Why? And it doesn't mean that belief is any less, but it's also part of development to go through an interview process.
Right. Exactly. And that, I think, making sure you connect the dots, right? Some people living in that aren't connecting the dots. They feel like what you're saying. And so the more that you're able to, again, equip either your HR, talent acquisition, the management team to be able to have those conversations. And yes, definitely gold star for having those conversations, understanding how someone wants to be rewarded, recognize what their career progression is, and how you can support that within your organization.
For sure. And Eric makes a great point here. It's even worse when companies don't get back to their candidate. No bueno. So true.
Yes. Please don't do that. I know. Independent of the number of people that you're hiring, and I know we've all been there, and certainly we've had people slip through the cracks too, but it always just pains me so much to not have some communication and some circle back.
Yeah. And just one of our last questions here. Are there any examples of internal questions or categories of questions you should always focus on for the internal candidate?
I mean, again, you know this person, right? And so you know what their skill set is. Obviously, they've been operating as the interim of that role, even more critical to understand and acknowledge that they're operating in the interim. So obviously, they understand the work and what the work entails, but focusing on some of those future, more strategic questions, specifically if it's a higher level role, around what would they do and how would they think about that, right? Specifically, if would be like a promotion for them and they don't have this skill set or experience from you internally or from past jobs. I think that's the thing that's kind of the differentiator. And again, helps you if you don't choose that candidate ultimately to help compare to what the external candidate is bringing in.
It's so true. It's such a great point. And then do you have one thing, the biggest mistake you see organizations making?
I mean, right now I want a big push about hiring for your values and being honest about your culture. I know that people are, and companies are in different iterations of values, but again, being as intentional, articulating as well as you can. People may opt out of your process. Look at that as a win because it means that you've been so honest and transparent about what it is like to work there. And also acknowledging not everyone is a perfect fit for you, your organization, and that role, right? Maybe great skill set, great experience, but it's okay if they're not a cultural fit for you. But I think it's such a huge mistake to not identify and spend time around how is the talent acquisition person or HR person, how is the manager, how is the team responding to and both selling, but as well as answering questions and explaining what it's like to work at XYZ company and what it means and what's important to us. And again, those values-based questions, I think, again, if you could be intentional with those and create kind of a hiring for a values playbook, super, super helpful to your team because they're asking the consistent questions across all candidates. And then you can compare those. So like we have some things around deal speed or frugality or, our customer. We ask those questions because it's incredibly important to know how people are going to respond and what their past behaviors have been regarding what it would be like to work in our environment.
I love that because Michael made a comment here. I left a great company only to learn the culture I was going to was the complete opposite of what I've sold on. I've done this too. And so now, Casey, I take your advice so seriously. And I actually almost try to tell people why not to come because I don't want them to feel they got sold a bag of goods that wasn't authentic. So Casey, thank you so much. This was an amazing conversation. I love that you gave everybody actionable pieces to take away. Hopefully, you don't mind if people connect with you. Casey's LinkedIn is in the speakers tab and just so awesome. So everybody stay with us because we've got our next guest coming on here soon. But Casey, let's go for a hike in Park City this summer. I'd love to catch up and just really appreciate your contribution to our community here.
Thanks, Anita, and thanks, everyone.
Thanks for joining us for HR Unplugged. This series is brought to you by BambooHR. Visit us at bamboohr.com/HR-unplugged for video versions of the podcast, additional resources, and to learn more about how BambooHR sets people free to do great work.